Welcome to the National Soccer Coaches Association of America webinar series. My name is David Newberry. I'm the coordinator of the NSCAA Club Standards Project, an initiative designed to raise the performance of coaches and players one club at a time. The NSCAA is delighted to welcome Robert Parr, the Director of Coaching for Arkansas Soccer and recently appointed member of the NSCAA Club Standards Project consultancy team. Today's topic is ability-based training. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you, Dave. And I'd like to thank everyone who has taken some time to join us for this webinar today. On behalf of the NSCAA Club Standards Project, I'm honored to be able to kick off this exciting series of webinars. For everyone, I'm sure if you've looked at the list of upcoming presentations we have planned over the next month or so, I think you'll agree we've got some excellent speakers lined up, and it's an honor to be able to kind of kick things off.
Thanks.
So today, go ahead, Dave.
Well, no, so thanks very much. Let me just do a little brief introduction to you before we start with your webinar presentation. And with 25 years of professional experience in the game, Robert is extremely qualified to present today's topic. The concept is grouping young players by likability, one that seems so intuitive for some but so controversial to others, and it's a great way to kick off this series. Robert graduated from the University of Texas in Austin with a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and a Master's in Business Administration. He holds the USSF A license, the NSCAA Premier Diploma, and the USSF National Youth License, and is an associate member and instructor for US Youth Soccer and the NSCAA. Robert has extensive full-time professional experience in the youth, college, and the semi-professional soccer games. From 1989 to 1995, Robert was the head coach of the University of Texas men's soccer team, leading the program to the national title in 1990. In 1995, he became the director of training for the American Soccer Club, the Eagles, a youth program better known as Lone Star Soccer Club. During his 7 years with the Eagles, Robert also coached at the collegiate level with South Texas Maine State and was a member of the state ODP and coaching education staff. During a 5-year period from 2003, Robert was the head coach of the Georgia College and State University, and in 2008 he became the head coach for the Puerto Rico Capitals FC, the first international franchise to compete in the Women's Professional Soccer League. Soccer is a family affair in the Parr household, and along with his wife Michelle, Robert is the co-creator of SoccerRom.com, an online suite of applications that has been helping coaches around the world since 1998. He is a periodic writer for the NSCAA Soccer Journal and has contributed to several books and served as the lead technical advisor for Big Green, the featured film about a small-town soccer team released by Disney in 1995 and starring Steve Guttenberg. Robert has been the director for Arkansas State Soccer Association since 2009 and will soon be making site visits as part of the NSCAA Club Standards Assessment Team. So Robert, I'll click onto the first slide and we'll start off there.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. So our topic today is titled Ability-Based Training. And I think a good way to approach this is that I like to think of soccer clubs as educational institutions rather than as just some place where we form teams and go and play games. And so if you think about an educational institution, a school, would it make sense to have a classroom where you've got kids who are just learning to count, kids who are learning to do basic addition, subtraction, other kids who are supposed to be learning fractions, kids who are learning algebra, and maybe throw a calculus or two students in the mix and expect one teacher in one classroom to be able to teach all that? It's not the way we organize our schools for a reason, and yet it is how we tend to organize a lot of our soccer programs. And as we visit clubs around the country, we see practices oftentimes that are structured along the lines of a team in which you have a great range of abilities. And we'll talk more about that. So, rather than going to our school analogy, keeping kids in their home room for all subjects, which wouldn't work very well. We've tried to adapt to some other methodologies, and you may be familiar with them under other names, such as pool training or academy-style training, but we'll stick to the idea of ability-based training if for no reason other than academy may be the most overused word in soccer these days, and it's not clear always what it means. So that idea takes us to the solution now, where let's start by looking, first of all, I guess at like a typical house recreational league, and you might think of these as being U10 teams. So we're going to take a look at our Big Cat Soccer League, and it's got 4 teams, the Jaguars, the Panthers, the Lions, and the Tigers, all cleverly named, I'm sure. And if you look at the way each team was formed, there might have, in many leagues, you might have had a draft or some sort of an assessment process, and then you allocate players. But the outcome is that they try and typically form teams where when games come around, you don't want to have blowouts, because blowouts aren't fun for anyone who's involved. So each team ends up getting a few kids who you might deem as superstars, a few kids who are pretty good, a few kids we're maybe just not really sure about yet, and then a couple of kids who are perhaps just absolute zeros, or maybe they're brand new to the game. And of course, I know that many coaches think that those are the only kids they get on the roster. But if you look across a typical league like this, this is kind of how things are done. And again, the idea is to have games where the results may be a 3-3 tie on a Saturday. The problem is that in a lot of places, actually, Dave, we'll stay back on that slide. A lot of places, if you look at how what happens is you have a parent coach who's drafted unwittingly sometimes, perhaps because we lied to you as a club and said, check the assistant coach box, and then, of course, there never was a head coach, so you get promoted at the last minute. And we'll give you a roster. We'll maybe give you a set of jerseys. We'll maybe give you a game schedule, but then kind of send you off to fend for yourself and say good luck. So teams tend to practice in isolation. Coaches have to find places oftentimes and say, maybe we're practicing at the field by the school or behind the church or in someone's yard. And so you don't get the sense of club out of that, and you have this huge range of abilities that makes training very difficult, even if you have an experienced coach in there. And with 25 years of coaching, I can tell you that trying to coach any one of these teams in isolation would be very difficult for more than about 20 minutes in a practice. So that takes us to a solution on the next page, which is what if we take a different approach. And when we give the coach the roster for the team, we also say, here is the field and the day and the time in which your team is scheduled to practice, and schedule it such that all of the teams in this Big Cat League are showing up at the same dates, times, and places so that they can train together and share resources. If we do this, then you can also, if you look on the left-hand side of your screen here, you'll see a 5th coach has jumped into our league. And now what we can do is to have an age group head coach, maybe a club director of coaching, or maybe some other skills trainer, can show up and can assist with these training sessions. And now this gives us the opportunity to take the best players from each team, and instead of grouping them with players of all different ranges when they're playing activities in the practices, to cut across their team lines and to group them together in similar numbers so that every player they're playing with and against in their practices is at a comparable level. This also allows us to have that lead trainer or age group director to come in, typically someone with a lot more experience in coaching, and to serve as a mentor for all of those volunteer coaches who were drafted to take their teams. And so what you get, and we're going to spend a little time on this slide, but what you get out of this is that in this model of training, every player will find that the challenges that the session poses are going to be a pretty good match for his or her abilities. And the idea is to get the kids into a state we call flow, where they're challenged adequately, but they're not frustrated. So they're not bored, they're not frustrated, they're just right. When they get into that state of flow, we see that they will oftentimes lose track of time. And so one way you know that you've run a good session is at the end of the practice, the kids are saying, is it done already? Or is it time to go home? Can we stay longer? When you get that, you know that's a good sign that your players enjoyed the session and were properly challenged. Now, a couple of things. In order to make this system work, you notice that the 4 team coaches are still here. One thing ability-based training does not imply is that you just hand them off to a knowledgeable expert and leave. The coaches need to be in part of this process or it's not going to work very well. A couple other things to look at here. There's an obvious question. How do you decide where each player goes? Personally, I don't think that it works well to label kids. You don't want to put that top group and tell all those kids at the beginning of the season, well, you're the gold group, and tell the next kids you're the silver group, and so on, because that, first of all, those rankings will probably change pretty quickly up and down, and secondly, the whole labeling is going to tell kids that, put kids in a fixed mindset that this is where you are and this is where you'll always be, and we know that's not true. But to figure out where players are, it's good to get a mix of objective and subjective assessment. Sometimes it's challenging to get objective measures, but there are ways we can measure how kids are performing, and you combine that with the coach's perceptions. But then remember that this is going to be fluid. A kid will have some weeks where he's doing very, very well, and then maybe other weeks where not doing so well. And it's okay to have some flexibility for players to move up and down. And notice, before we move on, one last thing is that the kids are still in their same teams. So although in practices they're going to be grouped according to ability as much as possible, when Saturday rolls around and their league game comes up, they're still going to be playing the Jaguars versus the Panthers. The parent coaches would still be in charge of those games, but what you'll find is that the players across teams who've been used to maybe marking up against each other one-on-one and 2v2 in practices will kind of tend to do the same thing in games. And so, again, even in the game environment, although they're not grouped strictly by ability, they'll tend to group themselves because they've been conditioned to do so in training. So this lets us move on now to saying how exactly, now that we've outlined this concept, how do you put it into practice? And so I'm staying with the U10 age group and looking at maybe an hour and a quarter in length for this training session. And it's easy just to kind of conceptually group it into thirds. And in the first third of your practice, the first 20 minutes, say, we'll do things that are dedicated to warm-up activities, movement education, and then individual ball skills training for the entire group. You work on that for about 20 minutes, and then you take a break, get some water, allow the coaches to reorganize the groups a little bit, and we jump into the middle third, where we now focus more on small-sided match-related activities, 1v1 type of things, 2v1s, 2v2s, and these can be games that aren't strictly 2v2 to 2 goals, but you're thinking more in terms of no more than 4 players who are sharing 1 ball in each game. And then again, take a break, get some water, reorganize, and come back for your final third, where you get into the expanded small-sided games. So again, more in the line of 3v3 or 4v4. Now, you'll note that we'll stay back with that one more here. You'll note it, David, go back, yep. You'll note that in that last third, one difference that you'll see in my presentation versus perhaps other coaches is that I prefer to keep the numbers at this age group maxed out at 4v4, even if the kids are playing, say, 66, which is typical on their games. And this is because the priority for me at these younger ages is to maximize touches so that we maximize skill development. And if you increase the numbers to 66 from 4v4, then you've reduced touches kids are going to get in each minute of practice. It also helps keep practices feeling different from game days, which has a psychosocial benefit to it. And by having smaller groups and more of them, you're able to be a little bit more precise in your grouping by ability this way. All right, so now we can move on. So let's take a look at what kinds of things you would do in each of these phases. In the first phase, you see the picture here. We've got about 18 kids or so. They're scattered across a large training area, and you see that every player has a ball. And an activity like this that you see might be players dribbling in space and working on different cuts, working on different turns. It might be activities where they're working on receiving balls out of the air. You can do shadow activities and so forth. But you're, again, looking to get every player getting touches on a ball, or maybe at most 2 players sharing a ball if you're doing passing-oriented types of things. Now, within this, though, we're going to have a common activity, but we want to pull another concept that is presented in the National Youth License, for anyone who's taken that, known as the slanty line. because some of these players are going to be entry-level players. And so for them, maybe to do just a basic pullback turn is quite a bit of a challenge. But other players maybe have played for 4 or 5 years at this point, had older siblings who played or parents who played, and so pullback turn is not going to challenge that player. So this is where the coaches have to individualize the challenges. And so for the player in the middle, they would say, that was fantastic. Now can you do that pullback with your other foot? Because maybe they're only good at it with the right foot and not the left. For the player who's a little bit further along, we say, that was great. Can you come up with 2 moves and do one and then quickly do the other? And so what you do is, as the coaches are circulating around this space, they're looking to praise players for their success as they do things correctly, and then to challenge them to help encourage them to go on and test the limits of their ability. There are a few other things to kind of take away from this environment. Remember, it's important for the coaches to spread out. So a colleague of mine introduced me to the grenade rule and had me wondering, what on earth is the grenade rule, Coach? Well, it's very simple. He said if you could throw a grenade and kill all of your assistant coaches with it, they weren't doing their jobs. They need to be spread out. And although it's perhaps a little bit morbid of an illustration, I think it's effective. So we want coaches spread out so that way every kid in the group is getting attention. Especially in these younger age groups, there's a tendency for coaches or for players to say, look at me, look at me. They want adults to give them their approval, to give them the recognition, to see them as they are trying to do new things. And so, again, having the coaches distributed around the area encourages that. There's also another benefit. Remember, we're talking about parents coaching their own kids and their own teams. When you go into this pool style of training, though, a parent coach can make a point of coaching all the other kids and letting the other coaches coach his or her child. And so, again, you take a little bit of that stress off from coaching your own child. So in this stage of the practice, you have a nice psychosocial benefit, because it could be that a player is a very high-end player and his next-door neighbor is his best friend, and everything they do outside of soccer they do together, but his next-door neighbor is a beginning-level player. In this type of a format, they can carpool to practice together. They can do the first part of the practice in parallel, side by side, but each be individually challenged. And so you retain those social ties, but you recognize that they have different needs. In this stage, you might have 2 or 3 different activities typically. Then we take the water break and we would move on to now phase 2. So in phase 2, the kids come back, and you see here that we've set up 6 different playing areas instead of the one large one. So we have playing areas A, D, C, D, E, and F. And when the kids come out, you might just go, okay, I'd like you, and you, head over to play on field number A. And okay, Sam and George and Frank, why don't you guys go over and play on field B, and so on. And it might seem that these pairings of players is arbitrary, but it's not. The coaches know the relative abilities of the kids, and they're looking to find, in this case, 3 players of comparable ability and send them off to an area and let them get started right away. And so everyone, again, is doing a common activity, but you can then have your coaches distribute around. Maybe one team coach is watching 2 or 3 different playing areas and looking back and forth. And as it begins to get a little bit too easy for a group, you can increase the challenge. Maybe an activity like this is 2 versus 1 with a defender in a triangle. Perhaps maybe you limit touches, you reduce the size of the triangle, you give the defender more freedom in a group, and all those things would increase the difficulty for a group that's having a great deal of success. You might have, at this stage, possibly 2 activities or an activity with progression. That would be pretty typical, so you're going to get a little bit more time going on there. And then one question you might ask at this stage is, okay, once we start grouping kids by ability and kind of putting Sam, Frank, and George together, is there some sort of a stigma that occurs, because the kids can look around and know pretty quickly who the better kids are and who the less experienced or less skilled kids are. But in my experience, what you find is that players are actually relieved when they see that they aren't going to be matched up in a game against someone that's either going to be too hard or too easy for them. So as long as the adults involved don't make a big deal about where each kid goes, and as long as we change the pairings up a little bit from session to session, recognizing the numbers of players who are there and and how kids have been performing lately. And as long as we give equal attention to all the players, my experience has been the parents will be fine with whatever grouping the kids get, because in the end, the kids are going to have a great deal of fun because the challenge is right, and that's going to be what the parents need. So next we move on, again, after one more break into phase 3, and here you might see the expanded small groups. So if your groups before were done well, it can be a simple matter of just saying, okay, those of you who are in field A, those of you who are in field B, you get together and go play 3v3 on this field, and so on. You can do C and D that way, field E and F that way, have a team coach go to each field, and here in this phase, you might just have one activity. Again, possibly an activity and a variant, but you're going to give them a little bit more time to play in these groups, and because the kids are all the comparable ability, they will challenge themselves at an appropriate level. Now, we move on to what if we want to look at a different age group. So let's step it up a group to U12s, and the approach here would be similar, but of course your practice session might go another 15 minutes longer, so an hour and a half. And with that, we would maybe think about the session in fourths, because we would need to add a little bit larger number components. So now you see the fourth phase has conditioned games, and in my example, again, I'm picking 5-a-side or 66. Again, other coaches may be more inclined to go to 77 or 88 at this stage, but for me, I'm still going to be biased in favor of skill development and maximizing touches, so I prefer to keep the numbers a little bit smaller. I also find that there's very few U12 players who have mastered 2 versus 1, so 66 is usually plenty of a challenge for them. Now, when would you do this? As your kids are getting older, as your teams are getting older, the importance of team tactics will become more relevant, more important. So whereas maybe with the U10s or U8s, I would do the academy style, the ability-based style at every practice, never have them practicing on their own with a team of huge abilities. At U12, perhaps, because you've already seen tryouts kicking in most places, and you've already got some grouping by ability typically in teams at this age, you might do one practice a week with the pool style, and you might do another practice a week with the team to get some more of the team tactics together. But that's a choice to be made working at your club level. Okay, so what if you now are in a club that maybe is a smaller club, or you're at a club that doesn't have professional coaches on staff or professional skills trainers on staff? You may not really be able to realistically implement a system that takes all 32 kids in your 4 teams and puts them on one practice field at one time. The good news is there's a modified approach that we call paired teams training that allows you to get a partial grouping by ability that actually is quite easy to implement and goes a great deal toward giving you the benefits that you need. And what you would do here is simply have 2 team coaches get in touch with each other, say, hey, you've got your U12 team, I've got my U12 team, why don't we agree to practice on Mondays and Thursdays together at 6:15, and the coaches can say, I'll take Monday's practice plan, you do Thursday's practice plan, and they can alternate the lead roles. And then in their practices, because they've doubled their numbers, they can at least usually cut their kids into an upper half and a lower half in terms of their ability. And there again, you're going to find that the kids are much closer to their necessary level of challenge as they go through their sessions. So this also has a benefit that oftentimes we see that as teams go from U10 to U12 up to say U13, and they're going from 66 to 8v8 to 11v11 environments, ultimately teams at younger ages have to get merged together to form the numbers you need for teams at older ages. And when you've done paired team training early on, then you've reinforced the idea years before you needed to have that you're just training your future teammates. And that's another thing that helps you retain players. Okay, so what are some of the pitfalls we see? Well, I've labeled these as imposter approaches, but one system that I'll see a club implement is the idea of the optional skills training day. So maybe they say 2 days a week you've got your parent coach training off behind the elementary school or the church, but on Fridays we're going to do a skills training day. And that is great for those kids who come, but it tends to, in many cases, lack the commitment that's needed to really benefit the whole club. Only some of the players will come because, by definition, it's optional. Oftentimes, the coaches aren't there, so they're not benefiting from the mentoring that they would get in the true ability-based model. And, of course, for all those kids who, on those days when you don't have the ability to group by ability, all your players may be having less than optimal training in those practices, and so their enjoyment of the game will suffer and their development will suffer. Another approach I've seen is the idea of the training circuits, where each coach will take one activity and have groups rotate through, and the coach does the same activity the whole session. Again, this doesn't tend to work very well even when you group by ability because it lacks the progression, and so your practice doesn't tend to build from an early concept and mastery into implementation in a game environment. And another thing you will see is maybe teams come together, but they are really just teams practicing in parallel. They haven't crossed kids up from one team to the other based upon ability, and so there again, you've lost the whole benefit. So remember, if coaches are required to attend a skills training day, and if it's taking the place of maybe one of their team training sessions, that can be a useful way to go. But if it's done just as sort of an appendage and very, very optional, then you probably aren't going to see a great deal of success from that. So what are the benefits? Well, the benefits of this approach, whenever you have this lead coach and who's there, it's going to help maximize the influence of those best coaches because they're going to reach more kids in each hour of training than they would with just being sent off to do one team. For those coaches who are new to the role, it benefits them greatly because they have a role model to assist them through the process. And it should make it easier for your club to recruit new coaches since they're not just going to be thrown into the fire on their own. And by having that lead coach there, it also helps to ensure that the club can implement their curriculum because you have someone who carries that responsibility and is bringing lesson plans for the whole age group. In terms of benefits for the players, it maximizes touches on the ball, and you've heard me reference that already. It makes it very easy to optimize the success ratios versus failure for every player because, again, they're always competing against someone who is a comparable match, and so half the time they may win that battle, half the time they may lose it, and that's where you want to be. It makes it very easy to individualize learning demands for each player using the slanty line and walking around and praising and challenging and giving kids a new challenge to try. It allows social connections to be preserved. Even though kids may need to be challenged at different levels, they can still carpool together to and from practice. And it is extremely fun for the players, again, because of the challenge matching their ability. So what are the challenges? Why is it we don't have everyone doing it? Well, in my experience, the very first challenge is this idea of tradition. It's not the way it's been done here before. We're not used to it, and that's not how baseball does it. And since people bring experiences from other parts of their lives and their sporting experience that aren't always unique to soccer, we have to overcome that sort of initial resistance. It's a problem sometimes because of the priorities that people have. If the focus is, I want my team to win, well, if I'm in a practice and I help a kid from my opponent next Saturday learn a new move and he uses that move to score a winning goal against my team on the weekend, well, my parents may not be too pleased with me for that. They'll be asking, Robert, why did you coach my kid to do that? And so that's something we have to overcome. When you're looking at the full academy style or pool-based model, there's a question of experience. When you have a group of 30 or more kids, that takes experience to manage that group. And so a great deal of organization, a great deal of experience is needed. And again, not every club's going to have that, which is why I made reference to the partial grouping approach. And then one thing that's not listed here would be the idea of just parents coming and saying, hey, when are we going to learn positions and learn how to play as a team? Because there's, again, a perception that for an 8-year-old kid or a 9-year-old kid that that's the top priority. And the reality is, if they ask me that, my answer is going to be, well, we'll learn positions once we know how to control the ball, pass the ball, dribble the ball, and shoot the ball, because none of it matters until you can do those things. So to implement this in your club, just to summarize here, the first thing that you're looking to do is to explain the benefits that we've outlined in the presentation to the leaders of your club, to your parents, to the other coaches. Choose the approach you want to take, whether that's trying to go all in with the whole league coming to the same time, or whether it's pairing up teams or something in between. You need to assign a technical leader for each of those groups, and that can be the most experienced coach, parent coach you have. It could be someone you have as a professional on staff. It's very important that the club is scheduling the training dates, times, and locations, and not leaving that to chance. Otherwise, the logistics will prevent you from succeeding. Your lesson plans, especially in the younger age groups, but all the way through, should adhere to a curriculum that defines the learning outcomes that we're looking for players as they go through each year of soccer. And ideally, if you can get the buy-in, you'd like to go all in because that will maximize the benefits. So just to kind of wrap this up, I would argue that the benefits of ability-based training in the way I've described is massive. And to the extent that we have obstacles, it is in our interest to work to overcome them.